Here on the town square of our national life, we dedicate the United States Holocaust Museum and so bind one of the darkest lessons in history to the hopeful soul of America.
If you don't have evidence to support the memory changes over time. It withers slowly.
We have something here that is unique, that is effective.
You have an unbelievable potential there.
We need to be the voice the Jews didn't have, and we need to know when to use it.
How can people get to such a point that they want to kill each other?
How it was possible for so many people to participate.
Innocent children, why were they not spared?
Why did I survive?
Why did people stand by and the world not come to our aid?
What makes people do what they do?
Can it happen again?
What can I do in my life to make sure it doesn't happen again?
Learning the lessons starts with asking the questions.
Good evening, and welcome to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Tim Kaiser, and I am the museum's Deputy Director of the Levine Institute for Holocaust Education. Thank you so much to the National Museum of Women's History for co-sponsoring this program with us this evening. Also, thank you for attending, whether you are here in the auditorium or whether you're watching or listening to it through our live stream. I do encourage you to join the conversation through our social media, and you can invite your friends, you can invite your family to follow along on Facebook and Twitter using hashtag AskWhy, hashtag USHMM, or hashtag Women's History. This program is part of a series of programs that focus on challenging questions that arise out of our new exhibition, Americans and the Holocaust. The questions such as, what did Americans know about the rising threat of Nazism? What factors influenced how Americans responded or did not respond to this threat? And then finally, if so much information was available, why is it that the rescue of the Jews was not a priority, but only for a few people who went against the grain and who decided to help? It has been 5 years that it took the museum to create this exhibition through the research and all of the gathering of the artifacts. And in many ways, it fulfills the mandate of the museum's original 1979 founding President's Commission. That commission stated that the museum, with its place on the Mall as a national memorial, needed to have special attention given to Americans and American response. So it's fitting that for this year, 2018, which is the museum's 25th anniversary, we opened Americans and the Holocaust as a way to commemorate the 25 years of the museum. Tonight's program focuses on the roles and the range of roles women played in the 1930s and 1940s as the United States responded to war. In the personal stories you're going to hear tonight, and in the newsreels and in the videos that you will see, they explore what was expected of women at the time and how those expectations changed as America moved from an isolationist society to one that responded and eventually joined the World War II. We ask then that tonight we will be guided And so through this, by our moderator, who I'd like to introduce now, Dr. Lori Ann Turgison. Dr. Lori Ann Turgison is the Director of Education for the National Women's History Museum. She is also a museum educator, and she works to create and develop programs that focus on the stories and events of women, and those women that transformed the United States. In so doing, she and the museum work to educate and to really empower and to shape the future, and at the same time, present a complete history of the United States. So we are thrilled to be co-presenting with the National Museum of Women's History. And so at this time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lori Ann Turgison.
Good evening. I am Lori Ann Turgison. I'm the Director of Education at the National Women's History Museum, as Tim mentioned. We're honored to collaborate with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for tonight's event, which aligns so well with our own museum's mission to tell the stories of women who transformed our nation. Tonight, we'll step back with our panelists to explore some of the roles women played and various ways in which women supported and impacted the country during the 1930s and 40s. Despite the diversity of our nation, there's a commonality that women shared during this era. They were all living through very challenging times that changed traditional roles and required courage, selflessness, and the willingness to make a difference. Because it's impossible to give equal coverage to the entire scope of women's contributions during this period, we'll highlight a few women who demonstrated these attributes. We'll hear their stories, review newsreels and film, and explore firsthand accounts of these women's actions. Our discussion will last about 60 minutes, and then we'll open the conversation to your questions. I encourage our audience in the museum to submit your questions on the index cards provided to you when you entered the theater. For our online audience, please post your questions on Twitter and Facebook using the hashtags USHMM, actually on the slide there, and Ask Why or Women's History. Museum staff will be collecting your questions throughout the program to pose to our experts at the end of the discussion. But first, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Denise Kiernan is an author, journalist, and producer who's been working as a writer for more than 20 years. Her works have been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Village Voice, Ms. Magazine, Reader's Digest, and Discover, among others. She's also worked in television, serving as the head writer for ABC's Who Wants to Be a Millionaire during its Emmy Award-winning first season, and has produced for media outlets such as ESPN and MSNBC. Her previous two books, The Last Castle and The Girls of Atomic City, were instant New York Times bestsellers in both hardcover and paperback. The Last Castle was a Wall Street Journal bestseller and a finalist for the Southern Book Prize. The Girls of Atomic City, which we'll be discussing in depth this evening, is now available in 7 languages and was named one of Amazon's top 100 best books of 2013. It was also awarded the 2014 American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Foundation Award for the best book published in the United States on government, politics, or international affairs. Gretchen Skidmore is the Director of Education Initiatives here at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. She leads the museum's educational outreach into communities and classrooms nationwide. Gretchen oversees the creation of many of the museum's educational resources and is leading the effort to engage teachers, students, and citizens across the country with groundbreaking content contained in the museum's exhibition, Americans in the Holocaust, described in Tim's opening remarks. Gretchen earned her graduate degree in modern German history. She was a Fulbright scholar and has taught in both secondary and college-level classrooms. Thank you both for being here this evening. And come over and join me. Let's begin by setting the scene and focusing on the traditional roles of American women in the 1930s. Gretchen, what's the significance of talking about American women's roles during this period, and why now?
Well, as Tim said, we've had the opportunity to dive into a whole different segment of understanding the Holocaust, which is how Americans responded to the Holocaust over the last 5 years, and asking those questions: what did we know? How did we respond? What more could have been done? You're seeing scenes on the screen of what the exhibition looks like on site, and we also have an online exhibition about that. So normally that those questions would have been answered through a traditional lens, right? A lens of government leaders, or maybe military leaders, or other people in society who've sort of set that narrative. And we have a picture of some of those, characters who often told us that story. So what we wanted to do was ask whether Americans responded in ways that opened up some new understanding for us of American culture and Americans' sort of lives at the time and what context they lived in. And of course, that meant we could unpack some of the stories of American women. So that's why for the museum right now, we're very excited about how these stories give us a sense of what agency was possible, sort of what resilience it took at the time to make a difference. And it also gives us a sense of what the overwhelming expectations were on people to get through that period and to also fulfill sort of societal expectations. So I think we have a video that gives us a sense a little bit here to start, put us back in the mindset of the 1930s.
Housekeeping still remains the most important business of the world. Each woman faces it single-handed. She must know how to cook. She must know how to set her table attractively. She must know clothes, how to buy, and how to make them. She must face death to bring children into the world. To her husband, she must be a companion, a sweetheart, a wife, and a mother. She must stir his ambition, pull him through failure, and keep success from hurting him.
What do you want for supper?
Whatever you give me will be okay. You're running the house.
Yes, but I'm running it to please you, dear.
There's that reaction after that line. Denise, I greatly enjoyed reading your book.
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed following the stories of Celia and Tony and Caddy, among others. What drew you to highlight this lesser known piece of American history and to frame it within the context of women's contributions?
So I was actually, initially laziness. So I was actually working on a totally different project, and was having one of those days where I just could not focus, and got distracted by the internet, as we all do, and I found myself on a Department of Energy website, which, as one does, I'm sure everybody always ends up there, and I'm sitting there, and down in the corner is this fantastic photo of these women. It's up on the screen now. And it was basically the history corner for the Department of Energy. And they said, these young women, this caption, many of them recent high school graduates from rural areas in Tennessee, are enriching uranium for the world's first atomic bomb. Many of them will not know this, for many years. And I thought, gee, that's interesting. And as a journalist or writer or anybody who delves into people's stories, the first thing you ask yourself is this really a story? Was I just asleep that day in history class and everybody knows about Tennessee high school girls enriching uranium? And so I started asking around and looking into things, and it became very clear very quickly that, and I had already done a couple history books and I love reading about World War II and early 20th century in general. And I realized that my perspective, and most people I talked to, their perspective on the Manhattan Project and the development of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy was a handful of really brilliant people, really brilliant men in the desert in New Mexico. And that was it. It was just those people. And the fact of the matter is there were thousands upon thousands of people who were involved in this aspect of World War II, many of them people of color, many of them people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, many, many, many of them women. And so I thought to myself, we're talking about, one of the most significant, if not the most significant development in the 20th century, something that continues to impact our lives every single day, don't we sort of owe it to ourselves to investigate this moment from as many different perspectives as possible? And that perspective is fascinating, but it's a very top-down perspective. It is the viewpoint of the people who were in charge, the people who were making the decisions, the people who held all the cards. And, you know, how to tell that story, it's not as much about, you know, women's history as it was just about complete history. I mean, just completing the history. And so I just became really obsessed with the idea of telling the story of the Manhattan Project through the eyes of a woman like one of the ones who was sitting on that stool with, you know, her perfect little hair and her skirt. And what was the Manhattan Project like for her? So then I started tracking people down, and actually the first person I interviewed was a man. So, you know, what are you going to do? But that's how it all came to me.
So how was that lazy? That was very industrious to me.
It started, but it's one of those things where they say, if you feel like daydreaming, let yourself daydream. So I always think if I hadn't daydreamed that day, I was supposed to be working on something else, I never would have come across that photo. So
thank goodness for that.
Yeah.
And Gretchen, we saw some of the expectations of women in the film clip just now. Tell us more about the status of women across America in the early 1930s.
Well, this is a fun question to answer because we've done some surveys of young people, and I think there's a lot of surprise at sort of the traditional gender roles that women found themselves in. And just to remember that in 1930, the vote for women had only been ratified 10 years earlier, so we see that being celebrated here in these images. But of a population of about 125 million, there were 11 million women employed, but 2 million of them were domestic servants. So many ways we think about women working are traditional, right? We think about professional women. Half of them were teachers, a quarter of them were nurses. And if we think about professions more broadly, if we think about lawyers, for example, 99% were men. If we think about engineers, 99% were men. If we think about housekeepers, 99% were women. So the changes that we're talking about in the 1930s and 1940s are really significant if you think about the context that we're beginning in. And I think this statistic that's on the poll here that will just sort of remind us that there was a preconceived notion that a lot of people had that the breadwinner of the family should be the husband. And as you see here, 82% of people polled said that a married woman should not earn money if she has a husband capable of supporting her. Now that's in 1936, so of course the context of the Depression is important here, but still I think for a lot of people to remember back to that context and what the Depression and what the challenges of the 1930s meant for families is really important.
And Denise, what was American society and culture telling women about how they should behave, what their roles were, what was expected of them, and what was possible for them at this time? You touched on that a little bit. But
yeah, well, I think echoing what Gretchen was saying, the level of expectations was incredible. Like that video captures it perfectly. So then the war comes along and they said, oh, by the way, in addition to all this, you're now going to go make weapons. You're now going to go into a factory that you've never gone into before. And there's this wonderful painting for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post that Norman Rockwell did, and it's this woman, and she's got 5 different hats on. She's a bus driver's hat, she's got, you know, a nurse's cap, she's got a compass on her hip, she's got a watering can, because you were also expected to grow your own food. Have your victory garden, and all of these different things. And in addition to all of those, she also has milk on her hip, because it wasn't that her role changed, it got much, much bigger immediately. So you go from 82% of people saying, yeah, you shouldn't work outside of the home, to we expect you to run the home and work outside of the home. Ready, set, go. And you know, for a lot of women, for a lot of the women I talked to, that was very exciting and freeing. But it could also be rather daunting. And it was kind of an interesting transition. One of my favorite stories that one of the women in my book, Colleen, shared. She went to Oak Ridge with her family extended family. She had uncles, who were plumbers, and her mom was working, and she had, younger siblings who were working, and one younger sibling who was also in school. The first time her younger sister saw her mother in pants, she burst into tears, because that was everything was changing so quickly. So you saw even younger generations kind of, be affected by this complete transformation of the workforce.
And it's interesting that given their status in society, numerous women were not only following the events in Europe, including the rise of Hitler and National Socialism, but many also acted on behalf of Jews who were being persecuted in German-occupied areas. Can you expand on that?
So we've thought about how this would play against each other, right? Women sort of stepping up to help with the war effort, but knowing that at the same time, women across the country, Americans across the country, are seeing a crisis abroad, trying to think about what their role was in response to that. And it depended on kind of where your resources were, what you were able to do. One of the people that we've, of course, seen have a very big impact at the governmental level is Edith Rogers, who became the first woman elected to Congress from Massachusetts after her husband died in 1925. And she was very active in veterans issues and all different things, but was one of the first members of Congress to really pay attention and vocally call out Nazi racial policies, and ultimately co-sponsored legislation, a bill with Senator Robert Wagner of New York that would have let additional children into the country who were German children, Jewish children who were refugees seeking safety outside their own country. And this is by 1939, after there's been widespread violence. So at that governmental level, she had an opportunity to really try and change the opportunity that our country was providing for people to come in. We had very restrictive immigration quotas in place, but these children would have come in outside those quotas. So she took action. Now, when you think about anti-immigration sentiment in the country, you can imagine where this bill goes. If you're a member of incoming Congress, would you vote yes or no on a bill to open the doors of the United States to a larger number of European refugees? 87% say no in a Roper survey in January 1939. They introduced the bill in February 1939, and the bill doesn't come out of committee. So she went as far as she could. She also does many amazing things in her time, 35 years in Congress. But I think, it's for us really moving to think that she took advantage of the position she had. We have another amazing story, though, that just shows that women in communities all across this country had opportunities to know what was happening to Jews and other persecuted civilians under the Nazis. And one of those stories that we wanted to share tonight was about a girl in Reading, Pennsylvania. Talk about an outlier, right? She's a young person who is basically living her life, going to school, and she becomes pen pals with a friend that she makes in Vienna, Austria. And that friend's name is Marianne Winter. And they get to be kind of, randomly connected through this pen pal association, Campfire Girls. And they start writing to each other and get to know each other. You see them here in their, in this time frame, like when they're about 16. And after Germany annexes Austria, things get very bad for Marianne Winter and her family. They put into place all the laws that had been in place for Germany for 8 years. And she starts to realize that she and her family, that they really have to leave. So does Jane Bomberger know about what's happening to Jews in Europe? She knows through the press, she knows through her friend. Mm-hmm. And so you see in this letter that Marianne actually writes to her friend and asks for help. Facts are that we have to immigrate under every circumstance. And of course, I know that you and your family have not the money to claim for us. Now I ask you, my dear, if it would be possible for you to get a connection with any rich man who would be able to give us an affidavit. So you had to get support from a sponsor in the United States to get an American visa. I know that will be very difficult, but as I have heard here, in USA, there are many people who want to help us. So, very poignant letter, but if you can see at the very top of that document on the right, Joseph Bomberger is the one to put forward an affidavit of support for this family. Who's the rich man she knows? Her father. So Jane Bomberger asks her dad. They support the family in saying that they will not become a public charge. They support the application of their visa, and actually the whole family comes over. So you see that big list of names in the middle? Max, Anna, Stefan, Marianne. They meet them at the boat. They take them into their home in Reading, Pennsylvania, and they also get to be good friends over time, as you see in the photo here. So when we were trying to think about how we could highlight the range of responses from women about persecution abroad in the midst of a crisis at home, these are two that we really thought stand out at so many different levels.
Yeah, that's a great story, especially, these girls meeting with their children, essentially, and still finding that way to act.
Yeah.
It's a really good story. And can you describe more broadly how American society in general was reacting to this information coming out of Europe, and why the women we're highlighting tonight are so exceptional?
Well, I think the isolationist nature of our country at the time, we know even as late as May 1940, after war started in Europe, the majority of the country believes we should not get involved in this war abroad. So I think that whole situation about thinking of America staying out of these events, but at the same time caring about individuals and caring about children, that really sets the stage for that.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to hear how these women and girls were finding the different ways to act during this challenging time in our nation's history, and we'll hear more about that as we continue our conversation. But for now, we're moving into the early 1940s, and we have another short film clip to watch.
In a number of communities, sewing rooms have been established. For some of the women who work in these sewing rooms, the training and practical experience they receive will not only make them better housewives, but it may also open up avenues to a permanent source of income. Many other types of employment are provided for women. In a number of weaving projects, instruction is given in an interesting and useful craft. Part-time employment is provided in many kitchens where clean, wholesome school lunches are prepared for undernourished children of needy families. In these projects, employment has been provided for 600 teachers, nurses, dietitians, and cooks. These household training courses have already sent hundreds of girls out into the world, well equipped to secure domestic positions and able to command skilled workers' wages.
So we have some polling data we want to share with you. Here we have a poll from 1939 that shows that only 39% of the American population supported women working outside of the home. But as time progressed into the early 1940s and war broke out, attitudes changed. This poll from 1941 shows a jump to 68% of the American population being in favor of women working. And women were being recruited for these opportunities to join the war effort and support America's fight against fascism across all levels. On this topic, the Holocaust Museum sent an email recently to its digital audience asking for stories about contributions of female family members who'd worked outside the home during World War II, and the museum received dozens of replies. Here are a few that we'd like to highlight. Show the range of ways women face the Nazi threat. So we have medical supplies, producing medical supplies for the Red Cross, working as a secretary in an ammunition depot, and serving as a gunnery instructor with the Waves. This was the all-female division of the Navy during the war. And suddenly women were thrust into these positions across the professional spectrum, and often, again, they were being recruited, whereas just a few years before, that wasn't their place. Let's look at some of the recruitment efforts that were present in newsreels across the country at this time. Just another short film clip here.
The Axis believed it was ready for us. Axis statistics, careful and accurate, had forecast this Army, this Air Force, this Navy. But in the production estimate, the Axis was wrong.
Aberline, have you ever considered the possibility of woman labor? American women?
The call came clear. Wake up, Miss America. Wake up, Mrs. America. Millions and millions of women who had never lifted a finger outside their own homes now suddenly resolved to set the world house in order.
This is like punching holes in a tin of scouring powder.
Instead of cutting out dresses, this woman stamps out the patterns of airplane parts. Instead of baking cakes, this woman is cooking gears.
2/3 of the jobs in defense industries can be done by women today, and officials of the defense program are advocating more extensive job training for women and girls. This woman is a modern pioneer, a scientist. She symbolizes the tremendously important work of women.
Many of these women came from walks of life not previously considered. The mothers, the young, the aged. When they were asked why they had joined the ranks of the hidden army, these women gave a variety of reasons.
I had a son on the Arizona. That's a good enough reason for anyone. I have a family of 10 million to look after. I send them cases of these every week to help them to get home soon.
I go to college, but I arrange my classes so that I can help out in the war effort. This way I'll get my diploma and war bond.
Do you have to have a reason? We're in a jam, aren't we? I'm sorry, but you'll have to excuse me. I'm too busy to answer damn fool questions like that.
Without the help of additional thousands of women, we cannot build the mountains of materiel consumed in global invasion. We cannot make good the millions of man-hours and woman-hours that are lost in a fleeting second's smoke and flame. As long as the Nazi cancer exists anywhere in the world, this is also a woman's war, to be waged so that no woman shall ever again clutch a starved baby to her breast, so that no woman anywhere shall ever be the slave of a fascist state that makes her no more than a brood mare. That is why the women of America, like the men at their side, must flock to war jobs and stick to their jobs until that day when an end has come to the devastation of the earth.
Women have always been the guardians of the home and the children, the future of our country. And they are determined that our democracy shall survive and that our precious freedoms shall be preserved.
These clips reveal a lot about the important changes taking place in terms of women in the workplace, and I think it just illustrates your point about women taking on all.
I don't have time for these damn fool questions. It's great.
However, we don't get a full picture of how difficult some of the work was and how much women had to sacrifice to do it. Denise, you found incredible examples of new opportunities that women were presented to women during this time, and you wrote a best-selling book about it. Before we dive into your book, can you tell us a bit about what life was like for women entering the workforce in the early 1940s?
For the majority of women that I interviewed, it was a very, very difficult, trying. They were from very rural areas. They were going to school and then going home and working on the farm. A lot of them did not have indoor plumbing. Even some of the women I talked to who had managed to go to college came from homes that didn't have standard plumbing. They had this level of expectation to not only help out at their home, but to prepare to help out at whoever their husbands was going to turn out to be at their home. And they also were constantly being encouraged, and a lot of these messages came through in the video clip and in some of those email responses you guys got. One of the women I interviewed, her brother went down on the Arizona. A lot of the women I talked to had brothers, boyfriends, cousins, everybody. It's very difficult to understand the impact this war had on everybody unless you lived through it. I mean, the war was in the comic strips. The war was on the radio. There were scrap metal drives. There were USO dances. And women were expected to show up for all of these, in addition to doing everything else that they were expected to do at home. And then also being presented with these new challenges and new expectations, many of which were, again, exciting for them, but many of which were a little bit scary and very different. And you had to, Colleen, who I talked about before, she found herself climbing on ladders and climbing on pipes that, were 10 feet in diameter, she said. She said, I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew I had to do it. I knew I had to do it. So there was this expectation not just of what your country wanted from you, whether you were hearing it in the newspapers or on the newsreels or in signs everywhere, all over town and recruitment efforts. You were also, getting that message from your family. And you were also still, a lot of these women holding on. You'd mentioned the Depression earlier. None of these people had forgotten the Depression, and a lot of them had, just barely gotten through. And the idea that there was a limited workforce now at home because so many people were away fighting, they now felt this expectation to earn money. So not just you get to earn money, you need to earn money. And with that that real economic need and those horrible memories of not so long ago, all of this combined to, it was a very, very challenging and trying transition. And there wasn't a lot of time for them to adjust to it. It was, they kind of had to dive in, and the resilience of some of these women and really kind of the adventurous spirit and just willingness to do something they'd never done before and take risks they'd never done and go places they'd never seen made a huge impression on me.
As it should. It's great courage there.
You know who really is similar to that in sort of our understanding of women who took risks, right? You're talking about danger. I mean, we have a couple of stories of women who actually, because of their affiliation with their religious organization,
absolutely,
right? They decided, this woman, Lois Gunden, for example, was very closely connected to the Mennonite organization, and they were trying to provide relief in southern France. And she ended up going over, because she was a French teacher, she ended up going over to just help with a school there where they were really putting a home together to take care of children who maybe came from Spain or southern France, wanted to provide safety. Some of them were Jews. And so her main job there was to take care of kids in this house. But in the end, once it gets much more intense, either as it did here in the workplace or as it did for her workplace, which was a home in southern France, police started coming to the door looking for the Jewish children, and she kept them out at one point and said, no, sorry, the laundry's not done, you must go away, we'll come back in a couple hours. Something that she managed to pull off to keep them at bay. She ended up getting arrested, by the way, because she was an American citizen in southern France once the Nazis occupied southern France, and was a prisoner of war exchange, went back home, and started being a French teacher in Indiana. So there was a lot of risk that these women took, but they heard about need, and they went to where they were asked.
Need was such a driver for so many of these women. It was the need to help someone they heard about. It was it was the need to help a pen pal. It was the need to do something, anything to get my brother home safely.
Yep.
There was such an emotional drive for so many of these women, many of whom were so very, very young and had never left home, that never been out from under their parents' watch.
Right.
And then you combine that emotional need with a very real economic need, and then on top of that, you have this sense of duty that is being communicated to them over and over again. And it was a very powerful, very powerful, yes, are you a girl with a star-spangled heart? Exactly. I mean, it was those kinds of messages were coming at them from every direction. But so much of it, like you said, really started with a real sense of needing to do something to make things better, whether it was in a small way for a loved one or in a much larger way for what they felt was the movement, the duty of the time.
Tell us about Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
Oak Ridge was a fascinating place. Oak Ridge was, you see it up there on the map, it's about 25 miles away from Knoxville. It would not have been on a map in the early 1940s. And Oak Ridge was a purpose-built town. So it did not exist before World War II. There were many communities there. We talk about sacrifice. There were about 1,000 families that via eminent domain were moved off their land. Some of them were given as little as 2 weeks to uproot everything. And these are people who have lived off the land for generations, literally had family buried on the property. A lot of people didn't get a chance to get their harvest in. Very, very difficult time. And Oak Ridge went from, groundbreaking in late 1942, so basically not existing. They get everybody off the land, they start building the factories and the housing and all of that. Between late 1942 and mid-1945, it went from basically not existing to having close to 80,000 residents using more electricity than New York City, and was not on a map. And
it's so shocking they needed so many people.
This is actually one of my favorite pictures. This is one of the main enrichment plants, the K25 plant. This was and remained for many years the largest building on the planet. It was more than 44 acres of floor space. Messengers would ride bikes from one end to the other for communications, inter-office communications. But it just cracks me up that this top secret city, not on a map, that's enriching uranium, builds a building that can practically be seen from space shaped like a giant U. And that to me seems like a design flaw. But it was, so you think about, the speed with which this place came to be, which meant you had a lot of those families that were moved off their land, they were basically going back to work, some of them, within a mile of their own, what used to be their property. And again, that sense of duty, that economic need. It was, it had 7 gates. There were, badges and passes and restrictions. So, it was beyond an adjustment for a lot of these women, young women when they showed up there.
And when you were interviewing these women, what did they say about what it meant to them to be directly a part of the war effort? And you mentioned duty, and they had family abroad, and they would do anything to help them come home safely. But what did it mean to them?
For someone like Dot, she remembered very clearly the day. She remembered hearing about Pearl Harbor on the radio, and then she remembered the day when somebody knocked on the door. And they hadn't found her brother, as so many were never found, but her brother was gone. And she was looking for a way to do her part. She said, I wanted to do my part. And she had always wanted to get out of her little town of Hornbeak, Tennessee. She always wanted to go. She said, I really wanted to go to Paris, but I went to Oak Ridge first. And but she said when she was on that bus, and she was 17 years old. She said she's on that bus approaching the security gates and, getting ready to, and there are guns and there's barbed wire and there are inspections and all of those sorts of things. She said, I wanted to get off that bus right that minute and just start running back the other direction on that road. She said, but even though I couldn't, because so many of them working there, did not know what the purpose of the entire area was. They might have understood their job. It was very much about compartmentalization. She knew it was they were constantly told it was for the war effort. It would help the war effort. It would help the war effort. So for her, Colleen, same thing. Her older brother, Jimmy, was away fighting. Celia, same thing. When she left to go to Oak Ridge, one brother was in the Pacific. Another brother was in Italy. And they always knew they wanted to do something for the war effort, but to be able to do something that they felt like might actually bring their family members home, it was by and large the biggest driving force for them. It meant everything to them.
Right. So the motivations around a sense of duty or mission-oriented work wasn't exclusive to the war, though. Question, what about the threat against Jews in Europe? Was there a sense of duty or responsibility to save Jews that seems to have motivated some American women to act on their behalf even during wartime?
Yeah, we've thought about how hard it is sometimes for us to measure what motivated people, but in some cases it's clear that there was a connection to an organization that requested their help. A lot of times we talk about people who were part of networks like the Americans Friends Service Committee or the Quakers or, HIAS or other organizations that worked together, often had women in leadership. In some cases, were asking, people in their congregations to come over. Martha Sharp, for example, went with her husband to a very dangerous sort of situation in Prague where they were providing relief on behalf of the Unitarian Church. So I think that's another example of people who felt compelled based on religious convictions. But she also got very involved in politics afterwards and had helped women and children in southern France get milk. So she took her own beginnings and then built on it while she was there. She tells the most amazing story of just the risks that it took too. Like she got to Prague thinking she was going to run an office, provide relief, things that were in normal frame of mind. And immediately when she got there, they said, okay, here's how you lose a tail. If somebody's on you, here's what you do. And if they come and get your documents, here's what you need to do to destroy them in the basement before they get there to your office. And, encryption was another thing she had to pick up on so that they wouldn't understand what work they were doing. So I think that's another element to it, which is surprising to a lot of people, how they stepped into roles that weren't always known as they said yes.
Right, and to that point, whether the women we're discussing went to work in America or traveled across the Atlantic, they seem to have known very little about what they were signing up for. What was so appealing about virtually undisclosed opportunities?
I think it's that at least with the women that I talked to, and it's hard to imagine any situation where people knew less about what was going on than the people who were working on the Manhattan Project at that level. And their willingness to kind of put aside the natural curiosity, which they all had, about what they were doing and what the results were going to be and how they were playing a part in this larger scheme. And it was frustrating sometimes because in some of those clips we saw, you could see, this woman is making gears, cooking gears, I think they said, for a very specific thing. Like a lot of people had the satisfaction of knowing I am, cutting out, patterns for a bomber. I know where this work is going. And so there was a definite level of frustration for a lot of the people, young women working in Oak Ridge, that they were turning these dials or moving these levers or doing this, that, or the other, but they had no idea what that impact was going to be. But what they were constantly told again was that it was extremely important to the war effort. And, again, that was enough for many of them to just say, okay, I'm not going to, because you weren't supposed to ask any questions. You weren't supposed to get too nosy about what was going on or anything like that. And for a lot of those women, that was enough for them, just knowing that they were contributing on some level, but still a little bit of a frustration that they can't say, hey, yeah, we just finished that bomber and it's going to, go to have a certain destination, have something, tangible.
And how was this work different than the work many of them had been doing before the war? You alluded to encryption and how to lose a tail. I mean, obviously that didn't come up at home. What were some other examples?
I think about some people did things that were very similar. If they were in an administrative role, for example, they a typist or someone who had worked in an office setting, it would have been a more natural transition. The environment of Oak Ridge would have still been very unnatural and strange, but the work would have not been that different. For someone like Colleen, I mean, she worked in that big K-25 plant. She said you were trained to do your job to the best of your ability, and you were given the minimum amount of information that you needed to do your job well. And that was the way they tried to keep a lid on what was going on there, so the compartmentalization again. She said, so that meant, you weren't often given the names of things. She said, she worked as a pipe tester. She tested pipes for leaks. She said, I worked in one room, a door would open, pipes would come in, a millwright would ferry a pipe over. I had a probe that I would run over various seals. If the machine beeped, it was a mass spectrometer, she didn't know that. If the machine beeped, there was a leak, I put a circle around it and it went through that door. If there was no beep, I put a check on it, it went through another door. She goes, that's all I knew. And then it was climb on top of these pipes, and we're going to check, larger, and she said it just became this, you're going to wear pants now. Okay, I'm going to wear pants now. So everything was constantly changing, but she would always say we were all in the same boat. And there was this sense of, she didn't feel like, and other women echoed this as well, I wasn't the only person who didn't know what was going on. And there was a sort of comfort in that. Dot, who worked in Y12 on the electromagnetic separation units, it was, if the needle goes this way, turn the knob that way. If the needle goes this way, turn the knob that way. If things start to spark, call the supervisor. That's it. And it was, it was a brave new world for them in so many different ways. But they felt at least like, because there were so many thousands of them there, that they weren't alone in their lack of understanding of their new world, but they proved to be, and there was so much written about this from supervisory positions, that they were an incredible workforce, and just supremely capable and focused, and really quite remarkable when you think about just the going from being a high school girl in rural Tennessee and then in the middle of the largest building on the planet. I mean, it's just a huge transition for so many of these people.
It was interesting as I was reading your book how comfortable I became with sort of the lingo and the not knowing, okay, they're making tube alloy for the gadget, for the project, on the reservation.
The product, yeah. And that sort of lingo went up the chain to even, the higher level scientists who did know more about what was going on. Just right. the wanting to control. But, there was an office of censorship during the war as well. So, I mean, just that controlling the language and therefore attempting to control the information and how it was or ideally was not dispersed.
Right. Denise, let's talk about the issue of personal agency. Tell us what everyday life was like at SIDEX and Oak Ridge and how it differed from the jobs and lives. So we've touched on this a little bit, but the lives the women were accustomed to, because definitely the everyday community was very different from where they came from.
It was, and at the same time, there were so many things that were new and different. There were reminders like this up on the screen, absolutely everywhere, about now loose lip sink ships. I mean, the idea of being quiet about troop movements and things of that nature, that was throughout World War II. It was just taken to a whole other level in Oak Ridge. And, if you were caught chatting on the job, I mean, everybody had a story about somebody who was, taken off the job and never seen again. So you had this level of secrecy and mystery that infused everyday life. Everywhere you went, you had a badge. You had a badge that indicated where you lived within Oak Ridge, and then you had a specific badge or pass that dictated where you worked. So, for example, if you worked in K25, you would have a badge that would say that. You weren't even allowed on a bus that would go to Y12. There were colors and numbers and different coding that dictated which bathrooms you could use, which floors you were allowed to be on. So your movements were constantly, in many ways, watched and controlled. Helen, one of my, this young basketball player who was working at a diner before she was recruited, within 2 weeks of landing in Oak Ridge, she was recruited again, she was recruited to spy. And this was quite common too. So in addition to this ever-present, these reminders and security briefings and a very visible security force that would constantly check, your papers, your documents, your badges, where you were going. There was also this entire sort of civilian force of people who had just been, recruited, like Helen. So she's, at her dorm. She literally gets called outside by these two men who said, we're wondering if you might be interested in just paying really close attention to the conversations going on around you in the dorm or in the cafeteria and at work. And if somebody's a little too chatty, or, here's a form you can fill out. And, what they were saying and where they were, and there's an anonymous drop box. No one will know it's you. And a lot of people got approached like this. So you were walking around in many ways, living a life you're living in a dorm, you're eating in cafeterias. It's almost like you've gone to college, but you really haven't. And then people are asking you to spy. And so it was this, in a way, it was sort of the duality of their experience there that made it all the stranger sometimes, because it was such a young workforce. They were trying to keep them happy because you didn't have to stay there. They didn't want people to quit. It's very hard. It's not good for production if you have constant turnover. So they would have dances, and they would have roller skating, and they had bowling, and they had all of these activities designed to make everything seem so very normal. And so to me, it was that kind of contrast between the secrecy and the encryption and the writing in code and being approached to spy and, 24-hour roller rinks and dancing and all that sort of stuff. It was that contrast that made it even stranger for some of the women.
But it seemed even less than the intimidation. It was knowing that they were working towards a swift end to the war, something that would bring about the swift end to the war that seemed to motivate them to stay. At least that was the impression I took away.
It motivated a lot of people to stay. It was, some people did not want to stay, but again, economic need often, encourage them to stay, because there were if you were dedicated to doing something for the war, you could try and find something elsewhere. Although the pay in Oak Ridge, they made the pay very good because they wanted people to stay. They didn't want them to leave. But there was a stress for people, because it operated 24 hours a day, the town, working so hard around the clock. And there's a deadline, but you don't know what it is. And there's an end to this, and there's something they're trying to achieve, but you don't know what it is. Whatever you're building is never finished because you don't know what it is. And that took a toll, which is why they wanted to make sure there was such a robust recreation department. And they eventually, one of the most fascinating aspects, I love that picture, one of the most fascinating aspects of the research I did in the National Archives was coming across the logs and reports of the psychiatrists that they brought to deal with people who were getting particularly stressed. They didn't call him a psychiatrist, though. He was the nice doctor you talked to if you were too tired. And there was a wonderful man, Bill Wilcox, who I interviewed extensively, and he became a friend. And he was getting an award. He was 90-something at the time when he was being presented with this award. And I was giving one of my presentations before he was given his award. And I was talking about these psychiatrist reports. And he gets up, he's 91, 92 at the time, I think, and says, "I went to that doctor. I didn't know till today he was a psychiatrist." And so yeah, it was very interesting to hear some of those perspectives.
That is interesting. And as part of the community, segregation was very much a part of the reality.
Yes.
This is the 1940s, and the experiences of African American men and women at Oak Ridge were very different from their white counterparts. The poor living conditions, being forbade to live or even socialize with their spouse or children, the lack of access to quality food. There were some horrific stories that you described in your book. And generally find that African American women's participation and contributions to the war effort are often overlooked.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
But you made sure to highlight Katie in your writing.
Katie, yeah,
Can you tell us more about it?
She was, it was very, there's Katie with her biscuit pans. she was remarkable, and I thought it was very important to make sure there was a voice that spoke to the African American contribution in Oak Ridge, and therefore, in the war. And Katie was incredibly generous with her time and her stories, and opening up to me, because as a writer, you want to make sure you're presenting as much information as possible, as complete a story as is possible. In the case of someone like Katie, though, you are asking them to give as much detail as possible about what was really a pretty horrible, experience in many ways. And, she was committed to sharing that with me, which was wonderful. So she had, she lived in a Hutman area. She came with her husband. They were not allowed to live together, so that's about a 16-foot by 16-foot hut. Mostly plywood, doors didn't lock, there was a little potbelly stove in the middle. People would be 4 to 5 people in one of those hutments. There was a women's area and a men's area. Katie said they called her area, the women's area, the pen. That's what she and the other ladies started to call it. There were curfews. There was a very limited amount of time she was allowed to spend with her husband. The jobs that were available were limited to domestic work, janitorial work, and construction. And, it was a very, she was not allowed to bring her children with her to Oak Ridge. And, so the question, of course, I asked is, with all of this, that you were facing, why did you guys do this? And she said the initial salary they were offering me, the pay they were offering me, was more than twice the best job I could have gotten in Auburn, Alabama, which is where she was from. So she left her children with her mother, so they stayed with her grandmother, and her husband went, and every week, like clockwork, they took their pay and sent a bunch of money back, to support the family. So, having her offer that perspective and just give an authentic voice to that experience was very, very important to me. I was very fortunate that I was able to talk to her.
And we are quickly coming to the end of our discussion. Just as a reminder, if you do have questions that you would like to share with our experts, please go ahead and write those down, the note cards, and pass those to the ushers in the aisles. Again, if you are submitting your questions via social media, the hashtags are USHMM, or hashtag AskWhy, or hashtag Women's History. We'll check them all. Multiple ways to get in touch with us. Okay. Gretchen, women were pushing back against formally accepted boundaries for their gender at this point in the history, and while still operating within a set of unspoken rules that were socially acceptable. How did that play out?
Well, as I was listening to Denise, thinking about a woman that really lived and worked in a profession where there were a lot of rules. She was a librarian, and she found herself in New York, approached by a rabbi who was a leader in the Jewish community in New York. Her name was Florence Mendheim, and she was actually approached to spy on the supporters of the Nazis who were in New York. They were called the Friends of New Germany. And as I was listening about the spying at Oak Ridge, there's so many ideas about threats, right, at the time, and threats to security, threats to really our nation's security. And she was asked, will you go to these meetings? Maybe we need you to change your name. You can be Gertrude Mueller. And if you go to these meetings, just try and take some notes, make some friends there,
Lyndon.
And let us know what's happening. And this was really risky. A lot of these things were asked of people who, she didn't step outside her job. She kept working as a librarian, but as she writes in this quotation, it was very hazardous. They openly spoke about violence against Jews at these meetings. And I think it's just interesting that even if you didn't change jobs, even if you kind of stayed in the lane, there were still challenges and, sort of learnings that took place that were we're just now uncovering, right? I liked what you said about, I'm so glad she sat and told me that story, right? We're so lucky that we've been able to see that there were people at all levels who were, really thinking about the Nazi threat in the United States and doing what they could, even on American soil.
And one of those women who was sort of in an elevated position of power is Eleanor Roosevelt. And it's difficult to have a discussion about American women in the 1930s and 40s without acknowledging her influence. How did the First Lady wield her influence and power, so to speak?
So you guys can stay another hour for that, right? Are you good? Because we want to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. No. We really think about the World War II. We think about Eleanor Roosevelt and Rosie the Riveter. I think those are our women in our minds. She was very much, as many people know, on the ground looking for ways to report back to the president when he couldn't get places, talking about people in America who needed help. She was an advocate for African Americans. I grew up in West Virginia, and there are many examples of times where she went to advocate and help unemployed minors, for example. And in terms of, the refugee crisis and how America was responding, she did speak out when the Wagner-Rogers bill came up, and she encouraged the president to do that. He said, I can't, but you should. And in the end, she also chaired a committee, a U.S. committee on the care of European children, to bring child refugees when that bill failed. And of course, was involved in human rights at the UN after the war and instrumental in the UN Declaration for Human Rights. So we can't really have this conversation about resilience and agency. I'm glad we got to bring her in.
Touch on that. And Denise, fast forward us to the end of the story. What was, talk about the revelation for the women when they finally learned about what they had been working on.
One of the things the main thing I did in the book when it came time for the women and the men in the book to learn that what they had become a part of was I worked very hard to have them stay in August of 1945. How did they feel that day? So most of them, most people didn't have phones, and newspapers were hard to come by. So a lot of people found out via word of mouth, or we're told, like, the president's going to give an address, get to a radio, get to a radio, get to a radio. And the president, this is after the bombing of Hiroshima, and the president gives a very long address toward the end of this speech that everyone is just glued to. So there's a huge impact. Something very big has happened with the war. That's all they know, and that was enough to pull many of them away from work. Then at the end of this, he mentions Oak Ridge. Well, people are then just flabbergasted. And then, then there started to be press coverage. So this very secret place they were in, limited press coverage and controlled, but started to be talked about. Some people were still very uncomfortable actually using that language that they thought they might they could use now. Other people, there was one particular scientist who just drove up and down the street shouting, uranium, 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 because he felt like he was allowed to say it now. Everybody's reaction, and other people like, shh, don't say that. And language was a very big part of this, right? People were just trying to process the information, and for a lot of people on that day, it was just, oh, there has been a really big development in the war, and we were a part of it. A lot of the images that what I found so fascinating about these people is that they lived in two completely different worlds, a world without nuclear weapons and a world with nuclear weapons. I don't know what it's like to live in a world without nuclear weapons. You say the bomb, I've got a whole catalog of images and pictures and ideas and language, nuclear winter and fall, all these things. There were some people running around that day talking about the automatic bomb because they just the language wasn't there. Repercussions and the real magnitude of what had happened sunk in for some people a little more slowly, and people's reactions sort of varied. One One woman I talked to, she was talking about her brother. She said it was so interesting because I was so happy that my brother was going to get to come home. She said, but I was so sad because so many people died and I had something to do with that. So she was actually able to hold on to both of those feelings at the same time. And another man who actually had witnessed the first test in New Mexico, he said it was a time of horrors. It was a time of constant horrors, and this was another horror that ended the other horrors, and which I thought was a very interesting way to put it. So a real wide variety of responses and reactions.
Right. So I think we have one last poll to show, if we could, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. So what this poll is showing is that between 1940 and 1945, the female percentage of the U.S. workforce increased from 27% to nearly 37%. And by 1945, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women worked outside the home. A poll taken in 1944 shows that over 80% of the population believed that women who held wartime jobs should be fired come peacetime, with some caveats. And in 1945, 50% of the population believed a woman's place was in the home. Gretchen, any final thoughts on that?
I think another statistic we probably should put on the screen is that there were 13 million veterans coming home looking for employment. By 1947, I believe 8 million are unemployed. So the pressure to find and secure a nuclear family in the traditional way was a real expectation that society set, and to really ensure sort of domestic security and the well-being of the economy. Much of the moves that we saw are reversed in an economic sort of demanding way, really based on economic need.
Right. Okay, we'd now like to invite our audience into the conversation with your questions. We encourage you to continue submitting your questions, and please do keep your submissions currently to just questions. All right, let's see. This one, these two kind of relate to one another. Can you quantify in any way the number of women who made efforts to help Jewish people in Europe? Is this a true rarity or something that happened on a large scale? Why didn't we take in the refugees? And why did the polling show that American attitudes were so against that?
So I think one of the words we used in the program was outliers, that these women are truly outliers, that for the majority of the polling that we know that took place in the 1930s, there was a great deal of public opinion that reflected resistance to raising the number of refugees that came into the country. Some of that is driven by anti-Semitism, some of it's driven by racism, some of it's driven by other sort of eugenic type ideas about what would compromise the health of our nation. And so I think that you put national security with all of those other strains in the society at the time. Both the public and the Congress were very anti-immigration, and that drove policy, and that drove our decision-making on that issue throughout the 1930s and into wartime. And certainly it became much harder for people to leave once war broke out, because it was very hard to find a place to get your paperwork in order. It was very hard to get the money. It was very hard to find a ship that would take you. And so I think that answers the question, right? What is it that's really getting in the way of more people coming at the time? And it was a complicated a range of factors that have really had us thinking about how this has been a debate in America for a very long time. And we think in each period, what are the motives and pressures on people, you know, causing them to see this issue one way or another, and how do they think about debating that in the midst of what's best for our country?
And I think the harder to answer part of this question was, can you quantify in any way the number of women who made efforts to help Jewish people?
We haven't done that. I think because the numbers are very small, and yet, of course, we've highlighted some of the ones that we find to be sort of representative of the type of work women did.
Right, okay. Denise, did any women at Oak Ridge feel regret later for contributing to the creation of such a terrible weapon?
It varied. It was, regret would be, this is just going to be based on the women that I talked to, of course. So even women that I knew who went on to work for, shall we say, in peaceful movements, sort of understood when I would talk to them about it, again, because I was trying to get them to stay in their 1945 mindset, there were a lot of instances where they were almost sort of, I'm trying to think of, like, Dot would be a very good example. So Dot, when the bomb was dropped, she said she thought it was sad that there were so many people who, had died, but at the same time, she wanted the war to be over, and that was it. Years later, she's working as a docent. This was in the 60s. And she was working as a docent in the museum, and somebody came up to her and started yelling at her about, don't you feel horrible about, everything you did, and don't you feel terrible about, working on this particular weapon? And she said, and that made me feel horrible. She said, but then I said to them, well, they killed my brother. And it depended on people's individual experiences. Some people had zero regrets. Some people had very uncomfortable instances where they were sort of being held accountable for a decision that wasn't theirs, and sort of asked to be the face of a decision that was taking place so many leagues above their head. So again, it really kind of varied, and even if their attitudes toward war and weapons had changed, and many of them said, I hope we never have to ever do anything like that ever again. That didn't necessarily mean for a lot of the women that I talked to that they regretted what they had done at the time, because their motivations at the time felt very real to them.
Right. One of our audience members has noted that this discussion has many similarities to the National Building Museum's Secret Cities exhibit. Are you familiar with this?
Sure, of course, yeah.
Okay.
I actually haven't been, but yeah.
Okay.
I don't live here. If I lived here, I would have gone.
Gretchen, are you familiar with it?
I also haven't been, but I had hoped that if I did go, I would go with Denise.
Yes.
And she would tell me.
That's it. That's what we'll do. Okay.
Yes. Oak Ridge is featured in that exhibit. And then there was an additional question about, was there any partnership between the Holocaust Museum or the National Women's History Museum on that particular exhibit? Not from our museum, not from the Holocaust Museum. No, it was a separate exhibit. Another combo question here. This is for both of you. Did working outside of the home as part of the war effort result in women becoming more politically engaged? And I think we've already touched on that a little bit. And also, post-war, do we know how women felt about being displaced after the war? Did it impact their marriages? You kind of touched on this too, and families being forced back into the home full time.
One of the interesting things about the Oak Ridge community of women, you had all of these veterans returning, and in so many cases, there were factories that, maybe they normally made pots and pans, but during the war they would make munitions. They were sort of retrofitted to suit a specific need. And then when those workers came back, they got their jobs back, and the women who were working there, went their way. Well, the women who were recruited to work in Oak Ridge weren't taking anybody's jobs. And they were actually trained to do something very specific that took a long time to train them. So they were actually in a very different situation when you compare them to a lot of women sort of outside the project. And a lot of the women I talked to, some were ready to go home, and some, wanted to go ahead and start families, but a lot of the women I talked to stayed and worked, and the jobs were there. So it was very interesting for them, because, we went from there into, then we start building up the weaponry and we get into the Cold War and all of those sorts of things. So it was interesting for the women in Oak Ridge because they did not experience that in the same kind of stark fashion that so many other women did who were working in positions that a man had vacated when he went overseas to fight.
So that's true of that polling data that we shared just a moment ago, that showed public attitudes saying women should return to the home and women should be fired. That was a little bit different in regards to the women at Oak Ridge.
It was a little bit different, and there were women who wanted to return home, sure, and did. But yeah, it was they needed. There were still jobs there. There were jobs that they had not, quote unquote, taken from someone who was away fighting, and they had a very specific skill set that was still valuable and would have taken, and this was after they figured out, a lot of people thought Oak Ridge was just going to disappear and not be there anymore. Like the war was over, it's going to go away, but that didn't happen at all. So the need was still there. Again, we talk about the economic drive. So that need was still there, and a lot of the women I talked to were happy to continue to fill it.
I think it's true, too, though, that the changes in the workforce, the changes in the work environment were not significantly I'm trying to think how to say this. They didn't really encourage women to stay in the workforce, right?
Sure, yeah.
Their wages were lower. Yeah. In many cases, they were still in sort of gender-specific roles in some of the ways they stepped into the workforce. A lot of daycare wasn't available. So it made it, on a lot of levels, not so easy to stay in, and a lot of expectations to get back out.
Absolutely. And there were, just because these women had these positions in Oak Ridge, some of them, like Jane, who's in my book, she was in a managerial position. She managed a room full of computers, which back then meant a room full of men and women going like this with a hand crank, calculator. But she was in a management position. And, but when I interviewed her years later, we were sitting on the floor in her living room, and she was in her late 80s at that point, and she had out all these. She saved everything, which I was fantastic for me, and she had job reports and all of these sorts of things. And one particular piece of paper she had, it was a pay slip. She had a little Post-it on it. And when her eye landed on that Post-it, she just became immediately just furious. And I said, what is this about? And I looked at it. She said, I put that Post-it on there about 10 years ago, so when she was in her 70s. She said, because I didn't want to forget this. And it said, I had men working under me making more than me. And she, so you think about it, and she put that Post-it on in her 70s. She was working in Oak Ridge in her early 20s. So 50 years later, she's still mad enough to write the Post-it. And then 10 years after that, she's still, And so there was one of the things I find interesting about this moment in women's history is that, it was a transformative moment for women in the workforce. But Jane, to me, she just kind of captured a lot had changed. Here she was, this young woman in a managerial position over men in a scientific capacity, and yet a lot had not changed. And she sort of, kind of experienced both of those things on many different levels.
So just one last question for both of you. You both brought two very different perspectives on this subject tonight. What do you individually want us to take away from this discussion? What do you want us to learn? What's the big takeaway?
I'll just say that for me, it's about inspiration, really, in thinking about how women were willing to make changes in their lives, to understand that they had personal agency in very challenging circumstances, and just to know about the choices that people made and to think about their courage. I find that inspirational.
Absolutely. And for me also, it's about valuing people's stories and their experiences. When I started interviewing people and I would approach them and ask them if they would sit down and talk to me, I was going to work on this project. The number of people who said, "Are you sure you don't want to talk to me? I didn't know anything." Oh my God. It was just decades and decades of really kind of just devaluing their own contributions and their own experiences because, you know, they hadn't gotten, you know, many other messages. And, you know, history is not something that happened. History is something that's happening now. And big moments in history, and even small moments in history, are not up to a handful of people. It is, everybody plays, many people play a part. The impact that they have may not be known for many years on either their country, their community, their family. So to just value people's stories, get them in archives. To do oral histories, get them to your libraries. Just value those stories of people whose stories are not often told.
Unfortunately, it's just that kind of work that is occurring here at the Holocaust Museum and at the National Women's History Museum. We value those stories. They're what tell the broader picture.
Absolutely.
All right, I'd like to thank our panelists, Denise and Gretchen, for sharing your expertise with us tonight. Thank you to you for enriching our conversation as well. Before we close tonight, I want to let everyone know that Denise's book, The Girls of Atomic City, The Untold Story of the Women Who Helped Win World War II, is available for sale in the lobby. And Denise is available to sign copies of her book. Additionally, please stay tuned for upcoming programs at the museum available in studio and on demand, including a daytime program marking the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht. We'll end this evening with a thought-provoking quote by Eleanor Roosevelt from 1946. And Gretchen, will you just provide us with some of the context for this quote?
Right. We wanted to invite all of you, and thank you for coming, but also invite all of you to learn more at our exhibition that's just down the hall. It's not open tonight, but come back and go to the online exhibition. But being here at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, thinking about the people in the country at the time who knew so much about what had happened during the war, what sacrifices Americans had made, what had been lost. Eleanor Roosevelt actually toured in 1946 at displaced persons camp, and when we pulled this to really have people thinking as they left a little bit about what the responsibilities we all have are and what the potential we all have to make a difference, is sort of part of her perspective here. So I'll just read it and then we'll end the program. I have the feeling that we let our consciences realize too late the need of standing up against something that we knew was wrong. We have therefore had to avenge it, but we did nothing to prevent it. I hope that in the future we are going to remember that there can be no compromise at any point with the things that we know are wrong. The most important thing for us to realize is the great responsibility that lies upon our shoulders.
Thank you, and good evening.